Good morning. We are so grateful to have you all back with us this morning. Today marks a beginning of yet another conflict in the world, in the Middle East, and we deeply grieve for all lives lost on both sides of that conflict. We particularly grieve for those children whose lives might have been dedicated to the cause of peace in that area. We're mindful of other conflicts in Ukraine and Sudan and elsewhere. And we would just ask that we begin this meeting today pausing for 20 seconds to contemplate, to meditate, and to pray for the cause of peace, that world leaders everywhere will have a desire for peace. Please join me in that moment of silence. Thank you. Now on to more mundane and less weighty matters. We'd like everyone to hear what the messages of today. And so just a reminder, do not put your interpretation receivers in your pocket. If you'll leave them outside on the table or just holding them, then you'll be able to hear more easily throughout the day in whatever room or breakout session you may be in. And finally, the interpretation channels obviously are here on these screens, and you're welcome to listen through those receivers. But again, keep them outside of your pockets. We were richly fed last night in our opening session with thoughtful and powerful insights from our keynote speakers, Ambassador Jahan and Reverend Dr. English and Elder Dushku. We have an incredibly distinguished panel of experts on board again this morning to discuss perhaps the symposium's broadest theme, understanding religious freedom. Why does it matter? I will share shortened bios for each panelist, but please read more about their professional accomplishments online through the links in the digital program. We'll begin with Nicholas Aroney. He is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Queensland, a senior fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University in the US, and a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law. He has published prolifically and led international research projects in the fields of constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, law and religious freedom. He has held visiting positions at various academic institutions worldwide, including at Oxford and Cambridge. And in 2017, Australia's Prime Minister appointed him to an expert panel to advise on whether Australian law adequately protects the human right to freedom of religion. Dr. Alwi Shihab is a senior fellow at the Leimena Institute of Indonesia, an organization that facilitates cross-cultural religious literacy to foster personal competence, or the understanding of one's own beliefs, comparative competence, the understanding of others' beliefs, and collaborative competence, or the ability to work together with people of different religions. He is the special envoy of the Indonesian president to the Middle East and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and is one of the world's leading authorities and scholars on the interaction of Christian and Muslim communities. He has also had an entirely different, fascinating career as an entrepreneur and businessman, which you can read about in his online bio. Dr. Jaclyn Neo, right behind me, is an associate professor of law and the director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies at the National University of Singapore. A scholar of comparative constitutional law, as well as law and religion, she has published in leading journals, most recently winning the International Journal of Constitutional Law's Best Article Prize in 2023. She, like Professor Aroney, has held several visiting positions at academic institutions around the world, including at Princeton University here in the United States. And she serves on the editorial board of several academic publishing outlets and is on multiple advisory boards of overseas academic institutions, including institutions in Germany, Hong Kong, and New Zealand. Knox Thames is an accomplished foreign policy expert working at the intersection of global affairs, religion, and human rights, particularly the rights of religious minorities. He has served on 2 different U.S. government foreign policy commissions, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and the Helsinki Commission, and served under both the Obama and Trump administrations as the Special Advisor for Religious Minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia at the U.S. Department of State. I think Knox Thames may be the only thing that the Obama and Trump administrations had in common ever. He's recently joined Pepperdine University as a senior fellow, directing its program on global faith and inclusive societies, and he is a non-resident senior visiting expert at the United States Institute of Peace. Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat serves as president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, established in 2008 to continue the legacy of her father, Congressman Tom Lantos. Under her leadership, the Lantos Foundation has become a respected voice in the human rights movement on issues such as advancing the rule of law and freedom of religion and belief globally. She is a former chair and vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USIRF, and teaches human rights and American policy at Tufts University. She serves as co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Summit, an annual gathering of religious freedom advocates and activists, and is on the advisory board of different organizations, including UN Watch. We have asked each panelist to share their thoughts on the theme of this session with a draconian time limit imposed of 12 minutes. But by limiting that time, we hope to preserve some time for questions and answers at the end. So please be thinking of those as you hear them share their thoughts. We will proceed in the order of introductions, beginning with Professor Aroney.
It's a real honour to be able to speak to you this morning, and thank you, Elizabeth and Brett, for the invitation, and everyone else behind the organisation. The hospitality is wonderful, so thank you very much. It is a very broad question, as Amy said, and we need to pause for a moment and ask, why do we need to ask the question in the first place? Why do we have to address the question, why does religious freedom matter? It says a lot, I think, about our time and how we who are advocates of religious freedom feel. We have a sense of some challenges and even threats to religious freedom. It seems to me that those sorts of threats are of various kinds. Tragically, in some places and at some times, religious freedom is just simply not on the agenda at all. It's not considered an important factor or an important principle. And then in other places, lip service is used or given to the concept of religious freedom. Many countries say that they believe in religious freedom and there is a substantial enjoyment of religious freedom, but nonetheless, even in those places, and I would say Australia is an example, religious freedom is challenged on a number of fronts. One of the ways in which it is challenged is that there are intellectuals who are now saying that religious freedom is an empty concept and that all one needs is freedom of speech, freedom of association and other human rights, and they will do the work of freedom of religion, so you don't really need it in the first place. A second type of challenge in countries that give lip service to religious freedom is that we appreciate that combining different rights together within a community is a complex matter, and that there are competing rights and rights balances that have to be made, and there's a sense in which, in my view, sometimes the balance tips against religious freedom and in favour of other rights. So there is that other sort of challenge. And I would say that a third type of challenge that religious freedom faces in countries that give lip service to it is the reduction of religious freedom to a private and individual matter, and a failure to recognise its corporate, communal and collective characteristics. So in order to address this question of why does religious freedom matter, I'm going to address it in the broad, and I'm going to propose that there are three fundamental reasons why religious freedom matters. I'm going to suggest, in a sense, three theses or three propositions about that. And they will concern, firstly, why it matters for individuals. Secondly, why it matters for religious groups. And thirdly, why it matters for societies as a whole. So let me work very briefly through those three. So firstly, it matters for individuals. And the key proposition here is that freedom of religion is a condition for individual human flourishing. And I would suggest in very brief terms that it can be understood in this way. Firstly, that it's premised on the proposition that human beings are rational and responsible agents. And secondly, that human beings have an interest in pursuing truths about the world and its origin, and about their place and purpose in the world. And that thirdly, these truths about what it means to be a human being, truths about the world, entail a personal commitment to living in accordance with one's place and purpose in the world. And so the conclusion of that line of argument, which I'm only sketching in very brief terms, is that human beings can only pursue such truths under conditions of freedom of thought, belief and practice, which to an extent is the core of what we might mean by freedom of religion. So that's the first proposition, the first thesis. The second propositional thesis concerns its importance for religious groups. And here, the underlying proposition is this, that freedom of religion is ordinarily exercised in community with others. And there are three related sub-propositions that I would present for your consideration around the communal dimensions of religious freedom. The first one is to recognise that this pursuit of truths about the world and our place and purpose in it is a common human enterprise. It's something we share as human beings collectively. Secondly, that the truths about ourselves and our place and purpose in the universe concern our relations and interactions with one another, how we relate to one another. And a third and related proposition is this, that human beings form communities based on shared commitments to truths about these matters. And that's why religious freedom is fundamentally a corporate, group or collective right. And so it follows that, on my thesis for this second point, that human beings can only pursue truths under conditions of collective freedom of thought, belief and practice, and that religious groups in that sense must enjoy freedom of religion just as individuals should. So let me turn then finally and thirdly to the third thesis, and that concerns why freedom of religion matters for societies as a whole. And here I want to present for your consideration a series of propositions in very brief terms again. And the first proposition is this, that societies flourish when the individuals and the groups within those societies flourish. Societies exist constituted by the individuals and groups that constitute them. And societies flourish when those individuals and those groups within them flourish. And there's no separating the flourishing of the society as a whole from the flourishing of the individuals and the groups within it. Further, and it's a related proposition, societies flourish when they are shaped by those individuals and groups pursuing and living out truths about the world and our place within it. Because we have that common interest in pursuing those truths about our place in the world and our purposes in it, as religious groups, as religious individuals do that pursuit, they contribute to not just their own flourishing, but the flourishing of the society around them. And so the third proposition that flows from that is that societies benefit from, they flourish from that free pursuit of truths about the world and our place and purpose in it. So I've suggested three broad theses with several subordinate and important propositions within each one as a way of thinking about why religious freedom matters in our time. And you can see that I've deliberately framed it so that we think about it both in terms of the individual, the religious group, and the society as a whole. And I think it's unfortunate that, to an extent, we need to iterate this and reiterate this in this context. Because, as I said at the beginning, the sorts of challenges that we are facing in societies about religious freedom, where the society gives lip service to religious freedom, often involves some neglect of some aspect of what I suggest are those core reasons why religious freedom matters, either because it's reduced to an individual or private interest and the interests of the groups are neglected, or sometimes there's not an understanding of the contribution that religions and religious groups make to the flourishing of the society as a whole. And it's very endearing to know that there are so many people in this room and elsewhere throughout the world who are committed to religious freedom across these three dimensions and are making very significant contributions to the advocacy of religious freedom and the protection of religious freedom in our countries throughout the world. So I hope, and thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you, I hope that even though they are very general and abstract, and I've only been able to sketch them in very general terms, that they offer a framework for thinking about the importance of religious freedom. So thank you very much.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude and appreciation to the Center for Law and Religious Studies, especially to the director, Dr. Brad Sharp, and the associate director, Dr. Elizabeth. I'm profoundly impressed by the performance yesterday when we joined the conference of the conference in Tabernacle. We were impressed by the speakers, by the organization, and by all what we have seen together. And thank you again, Dr. Brad, for the opportunity for me and my family to join this important event. Today I'm going to talk about religious freedom in Indonesia. Religious freedom in Indonesia is a complex and nuanced issue. While Indonesia officially promotes religious diversity and its constitution guarantees the right to worship, unfortunately, the reality on the ground is often more complicated. Post-Reformation of 1998, Indonesia went through more freedom and democratization after a long dictatorship of Suharto. As a result, the freedom of environment has caused the entrance and influence of the radical Islamic school of thought, which were banned during Suharto. It is well known that during Suharto, Indonesia enjoys very much the tolerance between religious communities because there was no influence of the radical group or the transitional group from the Middle East especially. During the time of Suharto, Indonesia has two important homegrown Islamic organizations. I said homegrown, meaning that it grows from within, not being influenced from other communities or Islamic thought, which was started to appear in Indonesia after the Reformation. Under the guise of freedom of expression, every community, every group tried to take advantage of the freedom of expression and try to disseminate, try to poison the mind of the people in Indonesia by introducing the radical thought. While we were happy because of the Reformation, but inadvertently, unexpectedly, the radical group came in to Indonesia, and Indonesia then suffered from that introduction of a very radical movement that resulted, as you know, the Bali bomb, that is after the Reformation, Marriott bomb, also after the Reformation. Before that, we Indonesian, we live in peace. Those two organizations are the pillars of Islamic teaching in Indonesia. And no one would imagine that from those two organizations will bring about terrorism, radical thought. But this is the unintended consequences of the freedom of expression and freedom of religion, which was brought by the new Reformation in 1998. As we know that Indonesia is a secular state with a strong emphasis on religious tolerance. The Constitution guarantees every citizen the right to choose and practice their religion. However, the state officially recognizes only 6 religions: Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. Outside these 6 religions, any new religion will face challenges in gaining legal recognition and protection. Indonesia, as we know, is the world's largest Muslim majority with over 85% of the population adhering to Islam, predominantly Sunni. While there is official tolerance for other religions, religious minorities, including Christian, Hindus, Buddhists, and indigenous religious groups, sometimes face discrimination both socially and legally. Among others, blasphemy law that criminalize defamation or insult against recognized religions. These laws are often criticized for being used to target minority religious groups or individuals who are seen as challenging the status quo. It has politics in it. Notable cases such as the imprisonment of former government of Jakarta highlight concern of the misuse of these laws. Furthermore, Sharia law in Aceh, the province of Aceh in northern Sumatra, has implemented Sharia law for its Muslim citizens. Contrary to the rest of Indonesia that operates under the secular legal system, this enforcement of Islamic law has raised concerns about religious freedom, particularly for non-Muslim residents and tourists in that province. Church building restriction. Building places of worship for non-Muslim communities, especially Christian churches, can be difficult. Even though there was a joint ministerial decree in 2006 on houses of worship require extensive community approval and permits, often resulting in delays or denials, particularly in Muslim majority areas. This is one of the challenges that Indonesia is facing now, and we are trying to overcome these challenges. Religious intolerance. There have been incidents of religious violence and discrimination. For example, Christian and Ahmadiyya communities have experienced sort of attacks on their places of worship. Similarly, Shia Muslim and Baha'is adherents face social exclusion and sometimes even violence from radical Sunni groups. We did not experience this kind of harsh attitude before the Reformation because of the transnational group that being introduced and penetrate the country that bring about such intolerant attitude. I have also to say that positive efforts have been done by the government and by especially the homegrown organization, Islamic organization, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, and also the government, because of the 5 principles, the 5 pillars of Indonesia, the Pancasila, the national philosophy that promotes belief in one God, the emphasis of unity and diversity. The government often refers to Pancasila as the basis for religious tolerance and coexistence, though its application may vary. Interfaith dialogue is also being popularized in Indonesia. Indonesia has numerous initiatives for promoting interfaith dialogue and religious tolerance, often supported by civil society organizations and moderate religious leaders. The effort aimed to reduce religious tension and promote understanding. While Indonesia provides constitutional protection for religious freedom, the application of this protection can be inconsistent, especially for religious minorities, as I mentioned earlier. An example of the building of church in one of the area of mostly Muslim area in Serang, even though the government, the central government, has given approval for the construction, but the local government was reluctant to issue the permit. Why? Because of the pressure of the radical group. But hopefully that has been resolved. Nevertheless, Indonesia continued to promote itself as a model of religious tolerance in a diverse and pluralistic society, albeit with significant hurdle. In this context, I will end with Leimena Institute effort to mitigate these challenges. 3 years ago, Leimena Institute initiated to establish what has been mentioned by the moderator, a program of cross-cultural and religious literacy. The program aims to enlighten and educate teachers of madrasa, religious school. Why? Because according to one survey, over 50% of the religious teachers are hit by intolerance. And this is very alarming because religious teachers are the producer of young generation. So if we don't mitigate this challenge, we may end up in one day having Indonesian youth as intolerant people. So the Leimena Institute, in collaboration with many Islamic organizations, established this program. What is the aim of this program is no less than to educate, to enlighten the teacher of madrasa, to be able to know exactly the exact teaching of Islam, which is far from radicalism and far from intolerance. The program has graduated around 10,000 people, and not only Muslim religious teachers, but also we conduct this program to Christian religious teachers in order for them to know what is about the teaching of Islam, which comes from the original source, the main source, which is the Quran or the exemplary life of the Prophet. We don't have that kind of intolerance, that kind of violation of human rights in the teaching of Islam. A brief example of this a problem in Indonesia, every year we have, I have to stop, this, just give me a half minute, because this is the beef of the... So every year we have a controversial issue when Christmas comes to us. The problem is some radical teachers would say that it is prohibited for Muslim to greet Christian during the Christmas day. So we have to enlighten our teacher that the Quran doesn't say that. The Quran even emphasizes, إِذَا حُيِّيتُمْ بِتَحِيَّةٍ فَحَيُّوا بِأَحْسَنَ مِنْهَا. When courteous greetings is offered to you, you meet or responded with a greeting still more courteous, or at least with equal courtesy. O Muhammad, the Prophet, God does not forbid you to be just and nice to those who are not fighting your religion or trying to drive you out from your country. I always emphasize to those teachers that none of the non-Muslim community in Indonesia is trying to drive us from Indonesia or fight our religion. So why not try to obey this verse of the Quran? And it is, finally, it is very clear. The Quran says, "La tus'aluna amma ajramna." Muhammad, Prophet, tell non-Muslim that you are not responsible of what we do as a sin, Muslim as a sin, and nor we are responsible of what you are doing let God gather us together in the hereafter and let him open up who among us are on the right path or not, which means this is a full tolerance and no curse against one another. And that's what we hope from the Leimena Institute to flourish and to expand to all ASEAN countries in order for us to try to create an inclusive and tolerant community. Thank you, and sorry for the overlap.
Good morning, everyone. First, thank you to BYU Law School and the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, especially Professor Brett Scharfs and Professor Elizabeth Clark for this invitation to be part of this first plenary panel on why religious freedom matters. As Professor Aroney had already mentioned, at first glance, this seems like a rather odd question. After all, the right to religious freedom is a well-established right under international human rights law, widely available in regional human rights mechanisms and found in most domestic constitutions. In some instances, it has even been called the first right or the oldest international recognized human right. Scholars have traced the origins of the specific phrase, freedom of religion, to as early as the 3rd century. But in truth, we all know that religious freedom remains an underfulfilled promise in many contexts and in some instances have been under siege. Reports by international organizations, government agencies, non-governmental organizations point to continuing violations of religious freedom worldwide. The two speakers before me have already pointed to some of these continuing violations and under promise. In fact, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Heiner Bielefeld, has once called religious freedom a human right under pressure. Even in the United States and Europe, which were pioneers in the advancement and protection of religious freedom, there has been waning consensus on its importance. In the United States, Professor Mary Ann Glendon, for instance, noted increasing open hostility to religion among some opinion leaders in the media, the world of entertainment, and the academy. Among others, opponents have attacked religion for being fundamentally inconsistent with other human rights, particularly equal protection for women and minorities. And these include religious minorities and even sexual minorities. Others have questioned the value of granting such important status to freedom of religion, questioning whether religion should be treated as a special category or as something distinctive. Why, for instance, should religion not be treated in the same way as any other non-religious beliefs? If you have a commitment to the environment, you have a strong belief in environmental protection, should that not be treated in the same way as religious belief? Some argue. And so these are complex questions which, as scholars, academics, policymakers have tried to grapple with, and will take years to unravel, but I want to take the 10 minutes that I have left to provide my own account of why religious freedom still matters. And I want to say that part of this account requires us to look globally beyond the Anglo-European context to provide a more nuanced and, if I may, persuasive account of religious freedom. The hope is that it will help us to understand that religious freedom continues to have salience for populations and communities across the world. So for the rest of my observations, there are two parts. First, I will identify two challenges, by no means comprehensive, but two challenges to religious freedom globally to illustrate why we continue to need to have the right to religious freedom and to promote the discourse and protection of religious freedom. In the second part, I will argue that far from jettisoning religious freedom, what we need is to strengthen and deepen our understanding of religious freedom, and to do this through local empowerment and to promote a more pluralistic consensus on religious freedom and its capacity to serve all persons. Or borrowing from the human dignity language, religious freedom for all. So moving on to the second part of my remarks, I want to point out two instances where religious freedom has been far too often forgotten and far too often neglected. And the first is the fact that religious freedom does not still enjoy a broad consensus at the local level. And there are still some important contestations that occur with regards to the core meaning and scope of religious freedom. And secondly, I want to argue that religious freedom is currently under siege, particularly from religious nationalism. And this is nationalism that is not just attacking religious minorities, but also minorities within minorities. And this, at times, rises to the level of violence, but not always. So firstly, I want to mention that despite the fact that there is on the international level a core consensus about religious freedom, the fact that it protects individuals, it protects the right to choose, it protects a significant range of religious practices. At the local level, we've seen, as, including from the second speaker, that it remains highly underprotected. In fact, despite the fact that religious freedom is found in almost all modern constitutions, there are still some exceptions. For instance, the Constitution of Brunei does not specifically guarantee religious freedom, but merely states that all other religions may be practiced in peace and harmony by the persons professing them. This sounds like a privilege and not a right. There are also important variations in the type of religious freedom protection that we see in different domestic constitutions. Some provide for the broader scope. The Philippines Constitution, for instance, states that the free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference shall forever be allowed. This provides the broader scope of protection, of course still subject to interpretation. But others still have much narrower formulations. For instance, in Afghanistan, the constitution guarantees that followers of other faiths shall be free within the bounds of law in the exercise and performance of their religious rituals. Gaps still exist in the interpretation and implementation of religious freedom guarantees in some jurisdictions. These include outright restrictions, such as banning of religious activity, and others are indirect restrictions, such as burdensome registration laws, as well as arbitrary rules on building places of worship, as I've mentioned. Some disagreement can be even more fundamental. In Malaysia, for instance, the federal court has been not willing to say conclusively that Muslims have a right to freedom of religion. The second challenge that we see is religious nationalism, something that was also mentioned by our keynote speakers yesterday. Now, religious nationalism is a very distinctive form of nationalism, which uses religious identity as a way of drawing distinctions between who are the authentic citizens of a country and who are not, creating that us versus them, the othering mechanism. And in promoting ideas of religious nationalism, religious nationalists create a vision of society and citizenship that is exclusionary by religious identity. And so those who are not from the dominant religion, those who are minorities within the dominant religion, they are labeled as deviant, heretical, and not authentic citizens. And we see reports with accounts of religious nationalism being associated with outbreaks of violence. But as I've mentioned, the negative impact is much broader and often more insidious. Such violence is often preceded by increasing constriction of religious freedom for religious believers, particularly minorities, as I mentioned, but in many ways, it also affects the ability of religious majorities to practice their religion freely, to exercise their religious faith in accordance to their conscience. In fact, religious nationalism often is imposes significant control over religious orthodoxy and practices. And in employing narratives that speak of resurgence, perpetuation, or defense of religious identity as vital for the preservation of nation, they also create a hostile environment for advocates of religious freedom. These advocates are then demonized as not just anti-religion, but also as anti-nation. And so those who advocate, for instance, the freedom to choose one's religions, these arguments are not debated on principle grounds, but are sometimes shouted out as a betrayal of the nation. Moving on to the second part of my remarks, I want us, in fact, as I've mentioned, to deepen and strengthen our conception of religious freedom by proposing a broader, contextualized, and pluralistic conception. One where religious freedom is not only conceived of as an individual right, something very important, but also as a common good for all. And in order to do this, I would suggest that we need to prioritize not only international engagements, but local empowerment. This would allow us to provide for a deeper understanding at the local level as to where the pain points are and what are the gaps that could be addressed. Not just need to be addressed, but could be addressed. And to see religious freedom as something that needs to also to be implemented progressively. This would not be the ideal in most situations, but I would say that it allows for a much stronger and concrete development of religious freedom. In fact, we need to also see that in different jurisdictions, even while we maintain a strong commitment, idealistic commitment to the core aspects of the right, the optimal operationalization of the rights may need to be calibrated and to be addressed through, according to the context. In fact, as we know, different jurisdictions may have different views about the appropriate relationship between state and religion, about its socio-historical position, and the need to operate within different political regime. And so local empowerment allows us to promote important discourses that could be much more sensitive rather than a one-size-fits-all solution. For instance, as the former speaker mentioned, one of the surprising things, if we were to just think about democratization, oftentimes we assume democratization would bring about the protection of rights, more protection for rights, but it sometimes can be the opposite. The converse can happen. And so local empowerment allows organizations to actually address these issues from a much more local perspective. I also want us to caution, I'll be very fast, the need to avoid a simplistic East-West divide about the nature and importance of religious freedom. While it is true that Anglo-European historiography has been an important intellectual source for dominant paradigms in religious freedom, it is by no means only a Western idea. Historically, for instance, scholars have seen intellectual traces of religious freedom in places outside of this Anglo-European world. My colleague at NUS, for instance, noted that the first constitutional guarantee of freedom of religion in Asia can be found in the 1889 Meiji Constitution, which provides that all Japanese subjects shall, within limits not prejudicial to peace and order and not antagonistic to their duties as subjects, enjoy freedom of religion and belief. Now, this is an 1889 Constitution in Japan. And so finally, I want to say that we need to recover the view of religious freedom as not only a human right, but as a common good, one that is made available to everyone in a society, but also seen as crucial to peace, which is the subject of the conference, one that allows for peaceful coexistence of religious majorities and religious minorities, an account of religious freedom that is ultimately a celebration of religious diversity, and one that allows for shared prosperity among different religious groups. Seeing religious freedom as a common good will require us to persuade religious minorities to see that yes, we may have disagreements about religion and truths, But ensuring that minorities have a place within society, that there is peaceful coexistence, is good for human cooperation and social flourishing as a whole. And so this would mean that changes in demography, changes in religious practices should not be seen as an affront to the dominant culture. I would say that Europe is grappling with some of this, but as part of ensuring that religious freedom in society continues to evolve and continues to allow for protections of all and the flourishing of society. I think this is a time and the place for more creative and contextualized answers to the possibilities of a pluralistic conception of religious freedom. And I look forward to the rest of the conference for us to engage more closely with the importance and ways in which we can promote religious freedom. Thank you.
Well, good morning. First, I want to thank BYU ICLARS for convening this wonderful gathering. Thank Brett and Elizabeth, two longtime friends and collaborators, and just express my appreciation for BYU's global leadership on promoting religious freedom for everyone and partnership. It's really been a fabulous to see how this program has grown and expanded across the world. For my remarks today, I'm going to combine the session topic of what we were focusing on and the topic of the conference overall, and try to address why does religious freedom matter and why does it matter for peacemaking, and then offer a few practical ideas for ways we can follow through. But first, there can be no durable peace without religious freedom. There may be the cold peace of a cessation of hostilities, but not durable peace until people feel that they can live together, recognizing the rights of their neighbors to pursue truth as their conscience leads, without fear of violence or discrimination. Religious freedom and peacemaking then go hand in hand. Without religious freedom, individuals will not feel safe to talk about the drivers of conflict, which often orbit around issues of religion and belief. The inspiring message we heard last night about the power of interfaith work can really only be unleashed if participants know their beliefs won't trigger government prosecution or persecution from society. Honest discussions will not occur if participants must continually look over their shoulder or withhold crucial perspectives out of a fear of reprisal. Human flourishing will more quickly come, however, when everyone can believe or not believe as they choose and live according to their conscience. Inclusive religious freedom can foster a diverse and tolerant society where individuals are free to express their views in safety. And the divine right of religious freedom protects individuals' ability to seek truth as their conscience leads, to find meaning, to share with others, and to search for ultimate truth. Religious freedom is an essential aspect of human rights, a cornerstone of a democratic society, and an often overlooked component to peacemaking. Thus, it also matters for peacemaking, as freedom of religion or belief promotes peace in ways that can promote healthy dialogue between different religious groups, which can lead to increased understanding, respect for others' beliefs, de-escalation, and help build a stronger, more cohesive community. Policymakers will succeed if they take this into consideration, and they will fail if they do not acknowledge the importance of religion to billions of people around the world. Billions and billions of people are searching for something more during their time on earth. Concepts of the afterlife address profound inquiries concerning mortality and the eternal. The desire for soul freedom is a prime motivator in every society. Men and women do not live by bread alone. But religious freedom is a right under assault. To arrest the rising tide of religious persecution and to promote peaceful societies, we need a holistic response that fights for freedom of conscience for everyone to ensure 21st century persecution doesn't bleed into the next century. Persecution continues as governments and authoritarian regimes want to set the rules on the road to the highway to heaven with stiff penalties for unapproved lane changes. And not only do governments persecute, but extremists and terrorists will stop at nothing to victimize any who challenge their twisted ideologies or represent different beliefs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the great research by the Pew Research Center which has found that roughly 84% of the global community believes in God or a higher power. At the same time, they found almost 2 out of every 3 people on earth live in countries with significant restrictions on the free practice of faith. This is a recipe for human rights violations and unrest as people struggle to live out their faith peacefully. In my recently released book, Ending Persecution, I identify 4 types of persecution and suggest ways to counter it. Often when we think about religious persecution, it sounds monolithic. But much like mutations of COVID that we've all learned about, variants of persecution manifest in different ways. Different illnesses require different treatments. The same is true for any response to defeat the various forms of persecution and to promote peace. So in the book, I identify the first form as authoritarian persecution, and I spend time talking about China's genocidal persecution of Uyghur Muslims and Burma's genocidal effort to cleanse their country of Rohingya Muslims. Next, I identify extremism as a form of persecution, focusing on Pakistan, where I've visited countless times. After that, I highlight democratic persecution, where a religious minority can use their superior numbers and leverage that power at the ballot box to transform their beliefs into law and then to have the state enforce them. And I spend time looking at India and Nepal. And lastly, terrorism as a form of persecution. And I look at what's unfolded in Iraq and the different efforts to rebuild conditions where victimized minorities feel like they have a future. But I don't just admire the problem, I also try to offer some practical solutions based on my 20 years of government service. And regarding the topic today, over this conference of peacemaking, one key recommendation from the book that I focus on is the power of education to prevent human rights abuses and promote peace. I mean, we live in a moment of unprecedented globalization with people and faiths intermixing as really never before in human history. Groups that you would read about in an encyclopedia or on Wikipedia, you're rubbing shoulders with at the grocery store, or your kids are playing together on the playground at school. As a result, as environments become more pluralistic, extremists are working to poison the cultural climate against that diversity. And so helping students appreciate pluralistic societies and respect for human rights is a long-term solution to protect culture from extremist degradation. Education is perhaps the most powerful tool in this effort. As the son of teachers in Kentucky's impoverished Appalachian region, I've seen how education can improve lives, lift people out of poverty, and bring generational change to families. And this is true everywhere. Yet teaching tolerance and positive pluralism rarely happens. So encouraging tolerance can safeguard human rights, fight the collective amnesia about a country's diverse past, and protect civic space for the diversity of beliefs. So I have 3 recommendations. First, I think teaching tolerance needs to be a diplomatic priority for the United States and its like-minded allies for peacemaking and human rights promotion. Education is a priority for those who fight against the values of diversity and pluralism. I've seen this time and time again when an extremist group joins a coalition government. They generally choose the education ministry if they can't get the Ministry of Interior. While they would prefer guns to control society, they realize the long-term strategic advantage of influencing future leaders towards their worldview through education. Playing a long game, these groups understand how changing attitudes just by 5 degrees can lead a culture to a very different point in just 1 generation. We should be as wise. And I've seen how direct diplomatic pressure can help. In 2007, when I was a young diplomat, a desk officer at the State Department working on religious freedom, I was actually tasked with evaluating the Saudi Arabian government's education curricula to look how it addressed diversity in education. And why was the United States concerned about what Saudi Arabia taught kids? Well, in a post-9/11 context, education was no longer a matter of internal concern, with Saudis comprising many of the attackers. And it was open knowledge how Saudi Arabia at the time was exporting hateful and violent textbooks worldwide for decades. The government had agreed to reform them, but this was an exercise of the Reagan doctrine of trust but verify. And of course, there's nothing wrong with the government teaching their country's children about their established faith. While it's not the American approach, international standards permit religious instruction on beliefs and theology, but not indoctrination, but to educate. But what we found was happening in government textbooks. They were teaching children to fear or hate others, sowing seeds that could lead to discrimination or worse, and sometimes even explicitly calling for violence. Thankfully, reforms have changed over the ensuing years, improving the textbooks, but it showed the importance of diplomatic engagement. But this kind of diplomatic work, I don't think, happens enough. Secondly, we need a funding revolution in education support, viewing it not just about reading, writing, and arithmetic, but a peacemaking tool that can protect youth from hateful ideologies. The United States is a huge supporter of education through our foreign aid, but in this we need to allocate specific resources for teacher training on positive pluralism, because educators play an incredibly important role in fostering an inclusive classroom environment. In the same way, resources are needed to improve textbooks, as in too many instances, they often reinforce biased views of certain groups or disseminate inaccurate or flawed depictions of historical events or neglect to acknowledge the presence of minorities altogether. How textbooks present and how teachers teach their curricula profoundly influence whether children appreciate and respect ethnic and religious diversity, so we need to have specific funding for teaching tolerance. And lastly, we need to leverage the power of sacred sites to promote pluralism. I've seen throughout my career discussing religious freedom can be a very sensitive and difficult conversation to have. Research I'm conducting at Pepperdine University and with the U.S. Institute of Peace is finding that sacred sites provide an indigenous inflection point to discuss the importance of respecting diversity, others' beliefs, and their holy places. Often overlooked, sacred sites literally provide a bridge to a brighter future, as sacred heritage tells of a diverse but often forgotten path. They demonstrate a history of living together despite profound differences. The Sacred Sites Promoting Pluralism approach that we're developing doesn't point or lecture, but it listens. It asks what can be learned from a community's own history of diversity, which is often layered and multifaceted, and then using that as a jumping off point to start conversations about living together in diversity today. And it can also work with contemporary sacred sites, using them as places of inclusion and inquiry, and not places of exclusion and separation. So with my program, we've held a series of discussions with practitioners from the field of human rights and religious freedom, cultural heritage protection, and interfaith promotion near Geneva and in Washington, D.C., and we're starting to see this idea gain traction. And we hope to find some funding to test it in the field, to take it from the theoretical to the practical. But we really believe that teaching a community about their past and their present diversity through sacred sites is an unexplored pathway that can bring about durable peace. By leveraging the untapped potential of sacred sites to promote peaceful pluralism and respect for different beliefs in a locally acceptable way, we can foster interreligious peace and appreciation of religious pluralism. So in conclusion, an underappreciated approach to peacemaking and a solution to the complex problem of persecution, I think, is education. It will not be easy, as we know that how children are taught is a sensitive issue even here in our own country. However, time is working against us, as once the seeds of extremism are sown, they can bloom into a mentality that justifies violence. So the United States and our like-minded allies should lead an effort through greater funding, empowering groups on the ground to create content appropriate for their context, as well as diplomatically encouraging countries to ensure their education systems teach positive pluralism. Proactive efforts to teach tolerance in schools and to remind societies about their diversity through sacred sites can help pluralistic communities live together in peace despite vast differences. And this is good for peacemaking and for religious freedom. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you. What a fantastic and distinguished panel. And of course, I have the unenviable task of following such brilliant and insightful colleagues up here on the podium. Now, I know we're at BYU, which has a reputation for being kind of a clean-cut school. And so you'll forgive me, Brett and Elizabeth and others, if I tell an ever so slightly racy joke. But one of my cousins, no longer alive, was the glamorous, slightly outrageous Hungarian actress Zsa Gabor, who some of you may have heard of, who was perhaps best known for having been married 9 times. And so I feel today a little bit like Zsa Zsa Gabor's ninth husband. I know what I'm supposed to do, but I'm not sure how to make it interesting. So with that ever so slightly racy start, let me just say that my colleagues have done a wonderful job addressing this very important question, why religious freedom matters. It's a wonderful foundational question for everything that's going to be unfolding over the next couple of days, and I do have a few thoughts to share. At its core, I would say that religious freedom matters because it speaks to and honors that which makes humans utterly unique among all creation. We are the only inhabitants of this world that are uniquely hardwired to ask questions about the meaning of life. Who are we? Why are we here? What is our purpose? Where are we going? This unique and profound singularity of humans really is the key to what gives meaning, purpose, and dignity to our lives. It was Socrates, you will remember, who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Because this is so intrinsic to what it means to be human, protecting the quest to answer these questions and then, very importantly, be allowed to live one's life in accordance with the answers one receives. It truly is, I believe, foundational to the whole human rights project. So many other fundamental rights flow from this wellspring right. And Professor Aroney, you said, others want to put those other rights sort of as a substitute, but they cannot substitute. Thinking of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, the most basic parental rights, of course, that are protected in the Universal Declaration, all of these flow from this wellspring right of freedom of conscience and belief. So religious freedom is important first and foremost because it is intrinsic to our identity and our dignity as human beings. But it also turns out that it is pretty good social policy for building strong and resilient societies. I want to give you an example from many hundreds of years ago, but it's a historical example that I think has relevance for our time. In 1685, King Louis XIV of France revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had been adopted in 1598, which had granted a measure of religious freedom to religious minorities in France, primarily the Huguenots, who were a Protestant sect in what was an overwhelmingly Catholic nation. This had been a significant step forward from the traditional doctrine you spoke about religious nationalism. Well, back in the day, they really practiced religious nationalism in a very explicit way. It's sort of embodied in a Latin phrase, cuius regio, eius religio. Whose realm? His religion. In other words, if you lived in the realm of a monarch, you were obligated to practice that religion. So this Edict of Nantes was something of a step forward in the journey towards religious freedom, but its revocation was clearly a big step backwards. So this placed the Huguenots in an excruciating position. They had very few options. They could either convert, face prison, and in the case of women, mandatory sort of imprisonment, if you will, in a convent, or they could flee. And some 200,000 of them chose to flee, and many of those refugees came to Berlin. Now, here is the very interesting lesson for our day in it. These Huguenot refugees ended up establishing many of the core industries that became the backbone of the economy in the region of Berlin and the surrounding areas. And really, the society, France, that had driven them out lost enormously in that process, and the society that welcomed them benefited. And so we see, and I think the analogies are very clear to our time. I don't need to spell them out, but we can see how a society that encourages and permits a degree of religious freedom is going to prosper. And indeed, modern research bears this out. I think my colleague Knox referred to the very widely known research by the Pew Research Institute that has shown that societies that robustly protect freedom of religion and belief are more stable, are more prosperous, are likely to be more democratic, much less likely to become incubators of extremism and violence. And interestingly, they are also societies where women overall have a higher socioeconomic status. So I would argue that defending religious freedom is good not only for the individual believer, but for the broader community. Now, I need to pause for a moment and thank Amy for holding the moment of silence at the start of our gathering today. But for me, I would be unforgivably remiss if I did not also pause to reflect on this somber one-year anniversary of the massacres of October 7th. Today, we are compelled, I think, once again, to think about the defense of freedom of religion in a world where the oldest and perhaps the ugliest hatred based on religious identity has once again been unleashed in horrifying ways. As some of you may know, I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. My late father, Tom Lantos, was the only survivor of the Holocaust ever elected to serve in the United States Congress and became its most ardent and eloquent defender of human rights. I consider myself, as that daughter of Holocaust survivors, to be really the most recent link in a chain that extends back 4,000 years. In some ways, I could argue that the descendants of Abraham and Sarah could be considered to be the ultimate community that sought and fought to defend and preserve their religious freedom rights against all obstacles across the millennia. Through slavery and war, exile, Assyrians, Babylonians, Macedonians, Romans, diaspora and scattering, inquisitions, pogroms, and persecution, all culminating in the Shoah, the extermination of 6 million at the hands of the Nazis. Through all of this, they refused to abandon their faith and their covenant relationship with their God. This minuscule, largely stateless minority, largely stateless for most of their existence, and so often despised community, has modeled for the rest of us why defending freedom of religion is truly of ultimate importance. The right, as my friend Knox said, to live our lives in accordance with our deepest convictions goes to the very essence of our human dignity. It is the foundation on which the entire architecture of the human rights movement is built. And if we do not defend this fundamental right, we will have lost our shared civilization. I can't fully express to you today how disturbing it has been for me, and especially for my 93-year-old survivor mother who lives with me, to witness the tsunami of hatred that the Jewish people have been subjected to since the savage massacre of October 7th. And I won't detail it now because time is short. But I think this moment is a test for each one of us. Will we stand up to defend these fundamental conscience rights against attacks wherever those attacks come from? It is surely a time for us to redouble our work in behalf of religious freedom for everyone, everywhere, all the time. One result of protecting religious freedom for everyone is that it almost always leads to religious pluralism. Such pluralism is a powerful antidote to hatred and extremism of the kind that we witness in too many parts of the world. The famous French philosopher Voltaire said, "When there is only one religion, tyranny rules. When there are two, religious war reigns. But when there are many, liberty comes. And along with that liberty comes a growing respect and civic fellowship among those who may differ in their most profound beliefs, but who share a commitment to defending each other's rights. Ambassador Sam Brownback and I, who co-chair the annual Earth Summit, the largest gathering of religious freedom activists in the world, civil society gathering, have often noticed that, or commented that the most encouraging and optimistic thing about the Earth Summit is seeing the way different faith communities stand up on behalf of each other. It's absolutely wonderful. Muslims speaking up on behalf of Jews and vice versa. Christians on behalf of Buddhists, Hindus for Baha'is, Sikhs in defense of atheists. You get the idea. It's a beautiful and an inspiring thing to behold. And it reminds me, actually, Brett, of the wonderful spirit that attends these fantastic symposia that you put on. And I believe this is the 31st. What a remarkable and distinguished record. I know my time is nearly up, and so I'm going to sort of jump to my conclusion. I learned many, many lessons from my wonderful father. He really faced and experienced personally the very, very worst of which humankind was capable. But despite that, he remained a remarkably and actually a profoundly optimistic person. And whenever I would feel a sense of despair or dejection about events in our world, my father would say to me in his charming Hungarian accent, and I can hear his voice now as I share it with you, he would say, "Don't worry, darling. We are just bending a windy corner of history. And right around this bend will be bright blue skies and wonderful possibilities." We are, my friends, at a very windy corner at this moment in our countries and in the world. But I too believe that if we now can summon the courage and the conviction to stand by our values and to defend the right of others to stand by their values and to live their values and belief, that we will bend this corner, and around it there will be bright blue skies and wonderful possibilities. Thank you so much.
We want to thank our panelists for their incredible insights as to why freedom of religion and belief are important. I've also appreciated their discussion of answers to another really important question: how do we persuade the doubtful? I think to a certain extent we're preaching to the choir here in this room and in our overflow room and in our online audience, but how do we persuade the doubtful? Professor Brett Sharps mentioned last night that religious freedom gives us the agency to live the very best version of our faiths. And of course, the second edge of that double-edged sword is it also gives us the freedom and the agency to live the very worst version of our faiths. Dr. Shihab has referred to that, as have others. And you know, the social and individual good that religious freedom does is to a great extent sometimes minimized and made invisible for various reasons. And the ill effects of religious freedom are often magnified for sometimes obvious reasons. So I think my first question to the panel, and this may be our last question, we'll have to see how much time they take with this question, but how do we persuade the doubtful? I've appreciated what you've said about the importance of education, cross-cultural religious literacy in Indonesia through the Leimena Institute, for instance. Jaclyn mentioned educating at all levels about the gaps in protection and empowering at all levels ways for people to address those gaps, and encouraging a pluralistic concept of FORB and society and emphasizing FORB as a common good. So those were some of the answers that I heard to that question of how do we persuade the doubtful. I'd like to just hear a few more thoughts about how do we persuade the doubtful that religious freedom really does matter and is a benefit to individuals and societies.
Well, I'll take one quick crack at that. I think the evidence is in. You know, we've referenced Pew. We see the results in societies where there is robust protection. They are more pluralistic. They are more tolerant. They are also, time and time again, more prosperous and more stable. And so we don't have to rely on our, belief, as important as belief is to so many people in this room. We can pull out hard, cold statistics and say, this works, and its absence does not work.
I would just build off to say it's interests and values, and I'm thinking of, as a former government bureaucrat, when we'd make the case to policymakers, Katrina made the interest argument. It actually achieves foreign policy goals because a society that promotes religious freedom is more stable, more prosperous, a better partner for the United States. But also as an American, it reflects our values of our country, that we were founded as a place, a haven for persecuted peoples to flee. The Huguenots fled to Germany. They also fled to the United States. And we've been a place of openness that's been part of our foundational documents. And also, here in Utah, the Mormon migration, 1846, 1847, that was a sort of a refounding of that commitment to religious freedom domestically. So it's who we are as a people, and when our interests and values meet, that's the place where we can really achieve durable, lasting change in ways that are in the best interest of the United States, and I think the best interest of our partners.
Well, that's a million-dollar question. How do we convince the doubtful? Of course, I think education, interfaith dialogue, all these are really important strategies. But I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves, and perhaps in dialogue with those who, religious majorities, or those who are doubtful about religious freedom, is to ask them why. Why would someone from a religious majority engage in certain types of behavior that oppresses the minorities in their country? What drives them? I think we can all agree that to some extent we all, as human beings, have a desire for meaning, but we also have a desire for a good life. And what does a good life look like? I think beyond having dialogue and education, both of which are really important, is to also recognize that people want to live safe and prosperous lives for the most part. And I think, therefore, economic empowerment is also an important aspect of ensuring that those who, maybe from religious majorities do not feel necessarily disempowered or may be in a position of engaging with religious minorities from a position of safety, If you will allow me a small anecdote, the recent parliamentary elections, general elections in India, I thought were quite interesting. As some of you would know, Hindu nationalism has been on the rise with this current government in India. And one of the crowning glory of the Prime Minister of India was the inauguration of the Ayodhya temple, which had been subject to significant litigation because of the question of whether, there was a mosque at the site, and it was pulled down by a mob, and then there was a lot of litigation as to whether or not this was a Hindu site or a Muslim site. Regardless of that, the Supreme Court of India sided with the Hindus and declared it to be a Hindu site with certain allocations for the Muslims. What was really interesting is that despite having inaugurated this site as a holy site for the Hindus, despite appearing at a massive ceremony that was televised, styling himself as a high priest of Hinduism, and that this was the high point of Hinduism in India, in the general elections, he lost that part of Uttar Pradesh. So in conversation with my Indian colleagues, scholars of constitutional law, I asked the question, why do you think, despite all of these religious nationalism and all of these glorification of Hindu nationalism in the region. In Uttar Pradesh, he did not win as much as he thought he would. And they said, well, people were pissed off, apologies for my language, people were pissed off because in order to build a temple, their land was acquired. Because in creating this narrative of nationalism, glorification of religion, they had lost out economically because they had lost their homes. And at the end of the day, I like to say that sometimes democracy and politics is about the bus stop. Who is building that bus stop for me that allows my life to flourish as well? So I think in some ways we need to also understand that economic poverty, economic empowerment are also part of this conversation that feeds into religious nationalism, that prevents people from seeing themselves as being in a better position in relation to the minorities and so on. So this is not to say everything else is not important, but I think this is also an important aspect of that.
I could add one other thing. I think about more than 700 years ago, Thomas Aquinas said something very interesting. He was asked, in effect, how does one, and he was, as you would know, a Catholic theologian and scholar and philosopher, and he was asked, how do you convince somebody that doesn't share your belief in the Holy Scriptures and the traditions of the Church of some proposition? And he said, well, one has to ask and consider, in relation to the person that you might be talking to, well, what do they regard as authoritative, or what reasons are going to be persuasive to them? So it seems to me that when we ask the question, well, how do you convince the doubtful of the importance of freedom of religion, it very much depends on who you're talking to and your audience. And so for persons who are of no professed religious belief, who would regard themselves as secular or as atheistic or even agnostic, one has to reflect on, well, what sorts of reasons that are truthful would be persuasive to them. And we could say that efficiency arguments or the sorts of societal benefits sometimes are going to be persuasive to some. In other cases, it's more questions of principle, that they might adhere to a particular principle of human liberty, but are not applying it properly to religion. One could talk through being consistent to one's principles. And then one is speaking to someone of a particular religious profession. Of course, what's most important to them is the system of belief, the revelatory sources upon which they rely. And of course, it's a matter of understanding, the best version of their religion, as it were, from within their particular religious faith and doctrine. And one has to then, therefore, I think, be humble in a sense, because how many of us really do understand very well the religious beliefs of others and so forth? So it is in that dialogue, and it's often people within the particular religious tradition that need to obviously do the most heavy lifting, as it were, because they understand and they share many convictions. So it seems to me that there's no one answer to that question. It's a matter of understanding, as always, if one is to persuade one's audience and the individuals one is talking to.
Let me end with very, very brief. I think we need to emphasize on education, to be honest to ourselves, not to have a double standard when it does affect our interests. If we can commit on those three things, I think our life will be easier to live and harmonious to have. Thank you.
Perfect words of wisdom to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Shihab, and thank you to all of our panelists. Again, we've been very richly fed, and the feast will continue throughout this day. There is a break until 10:45. We've gone slightly over, but we have until 10:45. You'll look at your program, and you'll see a buffet of options in front of you for breakout sessions that begin at 10:45. There will be 3 breakout sessions on this floor, 3 breakout sessions on the second floor. Let me just acknowledge as well, we appreciate all of those who have joined us not only in this room today, but in our overflow room and as well online. We have a considerable audience online for this symposium and are grateful for their joining us today as well. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their valuable insights today. Thank you.